Sometimes it's important to take a leap of faith, and that's exactly what George Janko learned when he left the Impulsive Podcast. You see, the Impulsive Podcast dynamic is pretty interesting. It's Logan, Mike, and then the third guy who they always happen to make fun of. In this case, it happened to be George. And it was this episode with Bobby Lee where George finally had enough. There was a lot leading up to this point, but all three of these guys started to gang up on George, and George didn't really like this, so he ends up leaving the set of the podcast, which was unheard of for a podcast host to leave a guest like that. Eventually, Logan Paul goes on Bobby Lee's podcast, and that's when George calls in and decides to apologize, and everything seems like it's going to be fine. Truth of the matter is, there was a lot of tension leading up to this point, and for George, he decided that this was his last straw and that he would be leaving to start his own podcast. And so, George repositions his entire brand to create the George Janko Show, and he starts his own podcast, bringing on all different types of guests. The podcast ends up being wildly successful, and by episode 69, Bobby Lee ends up coming on to George Janko's show where they completely squash any problems. In fact, the show was so successful that both George and Bobby expressed interest of starting their own podcast together, and they both talked about how much they respect each other and want to collaborate in the future. And I just want to be clear, I skipped over a lot of details. This was not as simple as I made it in this video. However, for George, leaving Impulsive was one of the best decisions he made for his career, and he's going to continue to be one of the best podcasters on YouTube because of his decision.